Here that the series has had the honor in memory of Lou Douglas, who was a distinguished professor of political science at Kansas State from 1949 until 1977, and one of the original founders of the UFM Community Learning Center. Our Fall 2001 series, titled Voices for Social Justice, is dedicated to the memory of his wife, Mary Alice Burton Douglas, who died in December of this year. We would like to thank President Weefald, the Provost Kaufman, the Kansas State Student Government Association, the colleges and departments on campus, and many individuals who helped make this lecture series possible. After our lecture tonight, there will be a brief 2-minute period where if anybody needs to leave, they may, and then there will be a question and answer period. Those of you familiar with the Lou Douglas lecture series know that the question and answer period is when things get really interesting. So we suggest you stay. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Timothy Dayton, the Lou Douglas Lecture Series Advisory Committee member, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Dayton?
I was asked by the Lou Douglas Lecture Committee to find a speaker to talk on labor, which is a pretty broad subject, a couple of years ago, and I asked around a few people that I know and slowly compiled a list of a few names. And one of the names that kept showing up on list after list was that of Carl Rosen. What distinguished Carl, among the people who kept being mentioned, was that he was the only person who had a direct daily involvement in the labor movement in a very practical sort of a way. Everybody else was either an academic or a labor journalist. There's nothing wrong with academics or journalists. Some of my best friends are academics and journalists. But we thought that somebody with this kind of day-to-day knowledge and a strong perspective on the history of the labor movement would give us something, a perspective that is not heard very often in the United States, and certainly not heard very often in the state of Kansas. So we asked Carl to come and make a visit. Carl's background, briefly, is that he worked for 13 years as a maintenance electrician and was elected to a variety of local and district union positions. In 1994, he was elected to a full-time union position as the president of District 11 of the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers, which is commonly known as the UE for short. He's been re-elected district president annually ever since then. He's been a member of the National UE General Executive Board since 1990 and a general vice president of the UE since 1994. Carl is also a founding member of the Chicago chapter of Jobs with Justice and currently serves on its executive board as secretary. Not being busy enough, he's also a board member of the Illinois Labor Party and has been active in the independent political movement in Chicago, particularly in the Latino community. He's a board member of the Committee for New Priorities, an organization dedicated to changing federal budget priorities. Carl has a BA in Applied Mathematics from Harvard University, from which he graduated in 1980. While he was there, he was active in the anti-apartheid movement. Despite all this, Carl has been married for 17 years and has a 7-year-old daughter. I'm very excited to be able to present Carl to you, and I look forward very much to what he has to say.
Thank you. Good evening. I think every meeting of any number of people these days starts obviously in the terrible shadow of the events of September 11th. So I wanted to just say a few words on that before getting started on the main subject. And I guess from a union perspective, I'd like to say a few words of what I think we've learned in the days and weeks since then. Because as we grapple with what it means and where we go from here, I think some of us in the union movement who've devoted our lives to it really think that right now what this country needs more than anything is to hold to the best ideals of the labor movement when it's at its best. Those ideals of fairness, of equality, of coming to the defense of those who can't defend themselves, and most importantly, of justice for all. But there's several ironies in what's happening right now, I'd say. If you look at the efforts being done in New York right now to deal with the crisis that's been created, despite the fact that we have very conservative anti-labor administrations both in New York City and our national administration in Washington, the people who have been called on to deal with this crisis are not Bill Gates from Microsoft or the head of General Electric. It's union members who are in the front line of taking care of all the problems in New York. Even those coming to volunteer to help clean up and search for, unfortunately at this point, I think search for remains rather than search for survivors, are union members. You have to have a union card to go in there as a volunteer. Not because it's discrimination or anything like that against others. It's because they want to know that it's capable, trained people there to do the work, and they're going to do the work right. Many of the rescue workers that were called on, and many of the rescue workers who lost their lives when the buildings collapsed, were public sector workers. The public sector, which has been much maligned, that this is something we should try to get rid of and eliminate and do without, that everything should be turned over to private business to run in the cheapest, most efficient manner possible. The public sector workers are now the heroes in this country, as well they ought to be. And then you extend that over to what everybody's now worried about, of course, is airport security. And suddenly we're shocked to discover that we have a very poor quality workforce doing airport security because they're low paid, almost all non-union, high turnover, low training, and no dedication to the job. That's exactly because that's the direction that our country has been going in recent years. And fortunately, at least people are learning enough to, now there are calls in Congress and elsewhere, and some possibilities that it may happen to federalize those airport security jobs, to make them federal government jobs, which means better pay, better training, higher quality, less turnover. Those are the things we're talking about. What's unspoken is they'll probably be union jobs once they are federal jobs, because most federal workers are unionized. So I think these are lessons that we in the union movement are taking from that one section of the aftermath. Obviously, we have a lot of decisions to make as a country about how we deal with this and how we move forward, and I could talk on that for quite a while, but that's not the subject of tonight's speech here. So this is not to say that all is well in the labor movement, and I'm going to sit up here and just tout how great organized labor is in this country, because it's not true. It's far from it. There are some very real shortcomings, and what I'd like to do tonight is to talk about how the labor movement did get off track over the last couple of generations, and what are some of the things that it can do to get back on track. And I will argue that for unions to make a real difference in this country again, as they once did, that they need to be leading the fight for all working Americans, not just for their own members. What they're doing can't be limited to just taking care of the day-to-day needs in the shop of their own members' wages and benefits, etc. They have to be leading a social movement that's working for improvements for all Americans. And that's why I call it putting the movement back in the labor movement. But let me start with a question that may occur to many of you here, who I'm sure almost none of you have ever been in a union, and may well, since you're from Kansas, a lot of you may well not have any family members who were ever in a union too. I recognize that coming in from Chicago, this is not exactly the same kind of union-friendly area. So I'm going to start with, why does it matter? Why should anyone care whether or not the union movement is successful in this country or not? Well, first of all, in the workplace, and many of you haven't been there yet on a serious full-time basis, but you will be someday, you'll discover that a union is literally the only check on corporate power. When you're a single employee there up against a corporation with lots of resources, you are very defenseless. And if somebody in management decides they don't like something about you, you are extremely vulnerable. And depending on the workplace, how that gets worked out, can be worse or better. But it's guaranteed you don't have any power to control your own destiny as an employee in most corporations in this country. So workers need unions. They need unions to fight for fairness on the job and for decent pay and benefits. And this isn't just factory workers that need this, or janitors, other low-paid service workers. Right now, we've been seeing for the last several months across this country thousands, tens of thousands of dot-com workers who thought they had things made, they were set for life, getting dumped in the street. No severance pay, health insurance immediately cut off, all the things that unions have been able to do to protect their members in situations like that, they're totally left without. Checks bouncing at the end, all kinds of things. And a lot of them are starting to think, in fact, I've seen articles in the paper that, they're trying to form organizations now. It's a little late, they're out the door already, but it's what they need. And it's not a pipe dream. In most European countries, most office and technical workers are organized into unions also in order to defend their common interests when they're dealing with an employer whose interests sometimes are at odds with theirs. So individuals need unions, and I think that's a pretty straightforward argument. But I think what a lot of people miss out on, and what our country is missing out on right now, is how much society as a whole needs unions on several levels. Unions in this country, when they were doing well, were able to deliver higher wages. Those higher wages drove our economy. The tremendous growth, the golden period for America from just after World War II through the 1960s, when we had tremendous expansion, when the American dream was essentially created and lived, was a period where unions were able to deliver high wages for their members. And with those wages, they were able to buy things that created more growth and more good jobs and kept going on that cycle. You look at the type of growth we had in the 1990s in this country, where we had a relatively long expansion, some would argue the longest expansion time-wise in U.S. history. However, the growth during that time was at a considerably slower rate than it had been in the earlier period. And in fact, much of what we thought was growth turns out to be false inflation within the stock market, which is all evaporating now. And I think when the actual growth records for the decade are able to be compiled eventually, we'll see that the growth rates are even slower. And even worse, many did not benefit from it because there was no agency there in terms of the unions able to deliver a big portion of the growth in the economy to those in the less paid sectors. So a tremendous amount of the wealth that was created in the 90s went in the hands of a relatively small section of society. Higher wages also have another impact on the economy and on the businesses that have to pay them. It causes those businesses to have to innovate. Necessity is the mother of innovation. If one of their inputs costs more, namely the labor costs, they're going to find ways to get more out of those people who are doing that labor, and they're going to find ways to get by with less of them. And it's a fact of life in industry, and you see automation and those sorts of things. But you know what? As a society, that's good, because that's where your productivity improvements come from, and only from productivity improvements can we raise everybody's standard of living and hopefully shorten our work hours so that we can have more time to spend with our families and doing other things that we might like to. You know, every generation in the past, or every 2 generations approximately, there was a major shortening of the work week, from 6 days at 10 hours to 6 days at 8 hours to 5 days at 8 hours. You haven't seen that. In fact, what's happening now is we're going to longer work weeks rather than shorter work weeks. We ought to be enjoying our productivity growth by having shorter work weeks, but we aren't, and that's in part because when you have a lot of cheap labor available, which is what's been created by having so many non-union workers in this country, you don't have the incentive for companies to invest in productivity improvements, to bring in the additional equipment, et cetera. Also at the societal level, unions are the only real check on corporate power. They are the only other institution that possibly has the resources to take on the big battles to bring about progressive changes in society. Who else, if it wasn't for the labor movement, would have fought to bring about Social Security in this country, or a minimum wage, or health care for as many Americans as possible, or public services? Even public education was a battle that was originally engaged by the labor movement in this country. And then lastly, unions are the key force at reducing inequality. Individual corporations may well benefit if there are a large number of very poor people without jobs who are absolutely desperate and will do anything for a job and work any number of hours at any low wage. Individual corporations may benefit from that, but society as a whole doesn't, and unions are the only ones that can prevent that. We risk sliding towards what you have in many third world countries right now in terms of the great disparity in wealth between the very wealthy and most of the rest of the people. The wealthy now live in armed fortresses, literally, with security guards armed with machine guns surrounding their villas and driving them to work and wherever else. In fact, in many countries, they no longer drive to work. They have to take helicopters because they have so stratified society. And if that's what we want to see develop in this country, then we can get by without unions. But if we want to see some equalization in this country, unions are the only check on corporate power that will allow that to happen. So I would say that the condition of the labor movement matters both because it's important for individual workers in their workplaces, but also because a healthy society requires decent, effective unions. So why don't we have the kind of labor movement that we need then? I'll have to go back in history a little bit, back to the 1930s actually, when the modern labor movement was organized, when there was the great upsurge and all of the industrial unions were organized in the basic industries like steel and auto, my union in the electrical industry, and all the other major industrial unions came to be. It was the time of the Great Depression, and it literally was seen as the only way out of starvation. It also was seen by the federal government as a way to get the economy back on its feet because they knew it would pump money into the hands of working people who could then spend it and start the demand going to get the economy rolling again. And so the Roosevelt administration publicly supported the organizing of unions, and laws were passed to help facilitate it. And workers organized by the millions. And these unions were very active unions that not only pushed on the job for better wages and benefits, but they also worked much more broadly than that. These unions were part of the communities that the workers lived in, and they fought on behalf of those communities, and they fought nationally on some of the major issues I mentioned, and everybody supported the unions. Even if you weren't a member yourself, because you didn't happen to be working in a unionized facility, you supported unions. Nobody would ever think of crossing a picket line and serving as a scab to break a strike. It just was a social taboo. You didn't do that because unions were the ones who were putting the country back on its feet. Unions were the ones who were bringing some fairness back into society and were the hope for the future. And the labor movement led social struggles at that time, such as for Social Security, for unemployment insurance, which hadn't existed, against racial and sexual inequality, which existed in many workplaces, and that's where the first battles started in that time period. They started a push for national health insurance, which Lord knows we still need today as more and more people are left without health insurance. And that was, many people don't realize it, that was part of President Roosevelt's original plan coming out of the Depression also, along with Social Security. He wanted to see that. And unfortunately, it didn't get implemented then, and obviously not since. So that's what happened in the 30s, and then what happened is World War II came, and the unions fully supported the war effort, agreed to wage and price controls where they wouldn't strike for higher wages, everything would be put in towards the war effort, and working people made lots and lots of sacrifices in this country during that time. But while wages and prices were frozen, profits were not, and the large corporations in this country made huge war profits. They had greatly increased orders from the government and elsewhere, and great new productivity improvements that they were able to keep all of because the workers weren't in a position to be demanding increases because of the agreement to try to keep everybody working as productively as possible. So when the war ended, workers said, okay, we've sacrificed, now we'd like to get back some of what we've lost, and you big corporations have made a lot of money, it's time to share it. And there was a great wave of strikes. The auto industry, the steel industry, and the electrical industry were each shut down for at least several weeks. In fact, those strikes overlapped, and a big chunk of the country's economy was shut down for a period of time. And those strikes were settled successfully, and they made large gains. They did not get back everything that they had lost during the war. Corporations were still doing very well for themselves, but they had proved that they were a powerful institution able to deliver for working people throughout the country. And they had clearly been involved in leading the social movements throughout the country, and corporations decided that this was something that needed to come to an end. And so the president of General Electric, which then as now was one of the most powerful corporations in the world, a man named C.E. Wilson, gave a famous speech at the end of 1946 in which he boldly said that the United States faced two problems: Russia abroad and labor at home. And what he was essentially doing was declaring the beginning of the Cold War and the McCarthy period in this country. And this was the absolute key turning point for labor in the United States. What was happening was, on the surface, the U.S. government policy and certainly the media and the corporations and many social institutions, what was happening was we were taking on a supposed Russian military threat against the United States, and we were also taking on supposed communist infiltrators here who were going to do terrible things to our country. In reality, the practical effect of that period, what they were really trying to do was to drive labor out of its prominent role in setting U.S. policy. And this effort worked. The labor movement became split in the middle of this, divided and weakened. There were 11 unions that stood up and said, no, we're not going to stand for this. We have our rights as Americans to continue to speak out on what we think is important. They wanted a more militant, outspoken role for labor. They ended up leaving the main labor federation of the industrial unions at that time, what's known as the CIO and the AFL-CIO these days. And other unions stayed behind, and those that stayed behind, combined with the old, more conservative AFL unions, essentially made an unwritten pact with government and with big business that if they would be left alone during this tumultuous period, they would only deal with issues that directly affected their members in the workplaces, that they would drop their social advocacy in general and just take care of their members at home. And those unions worked along with the government and the corporations to in fact destroy the 11 unions that wanted to continue the traditions that had been built in the 30s and early 40s up through 46. They attacked those 11 unions, and in fact only 2 of the 11 unions even survived the decade, and that's my union, the United Electrical Workers, UE, and the West Coast Longshoremen Union, and they still survive to this day also. But we took tremendous hits. Our membership was well over 500,000. We were, I think, the 3rd biggest union in the country at that time, and within a decade or so we were down to a little over 100,000 members, so we lost almost 80% of our membership. And to understand how this could happen, that whole huge unions of millions of members altogether could be just wiped out in the period of a few years, you have to really understand the atmosphere there at that time. And I guess, given the traumatic events of the last few weeks, you might understand it a little bit, but people were in tremendous fear on a daily basis that an atom bomb might be about to be dropped on us. There were drills being done in all the schools and workplaces on how to hide if a bomb fell on you, as if that was going to matter at that point. But this was really worked into the national psyche, in that there were all these communists supposedly running around helping to blow up their own country for whatever reason anybody would want to do that. And they had then these congressional investigations of searching out people wherever they might be, which became witch hunts and were later found to be unconstitutional and a real attack on the civil liberties of the American people, and in most cases ruined the careers, destroyed the lives of good patriotic Americans. And what they would do to unions like mine, literally, they would have a congressional committee come into a town where we had a local, and they would subpoena the entire leadership of our local union, not on the basis of any wrongdoing, but just, they wanted to get testimony from them about what did they know about any un-American activity. Based on those subpoenas, no accusation of wrongdoing, the company would fire the entire union leadership for having even been subpoenaed. And now you've got the membership there without any leadership left, and all of a sudden a new union would show up. And there would be such fear-mongering going on, it would be very easy for this new union to essentially take over the location, and the company would always be cooperative in this because they wanted a more docile union in there anyway. And very quickly the whole operation would get turned over to a new, more conservative union. The upshot of this period is that labor went to sleep in this country. Membership had gotten to a peak of about 35% of the American workforce. More than 1 in 3 workers in this country were members of labor unions. These unions were able, because of those membership numbers, still to deliver, and in part because of the social pact that had essentially been made with big business, they were still able to deliver decent wages and improved benefits for people. But they were mute on social policy. They had given up their role as a social conscience of America. They began to do things like negotiate health insurance for the first time for their own members, rather than fight for the national health insurance plan, which was part of the great plans that Roosevelt had had, which meant that their members would have it, but very few others would have it. And in fact, what it created was a two-tier workforce in this country, where you started to have a big division between those who were in unions and those who weren't, which, of course, inevitably would eventually undermine the standards of those who were union members, because you were making it relatively cheaper and cheaper for companies that were operating non-union, because there was more and more of a gap there. And unions during this time especially became mute on foreign policy. In fact, that was what was of greatest concern to the corporations at that time, because what that allowed is the U.S. to start on a foreign policy of installing friendly governments around the world, especially in less developed countries. And by friendly, it didn't mean friendly to the American people in general necessarily. It meant friendly to U.S. corporations coming in and being able to set up business and start operating there. And what this was doing was, in fact, setting the stage for moving so many jobs out of the United States to other countries, and primarily starting with a lot of those good union jobs that we had created here. Unions lost their drive, they lost their energy. A lot of their most militant leaders had been purged. Those who had the strongest belief in democracy, both in their unions as well as in society as a whole, they had been driven out. Unions stopped organizing by and large. They had shifted into a mode of taking care of their own members. And this did not mean expanding and going and organizing the unorganized. And because there was this need to kind of maintain control and not be shaking the tree in America in general, a lot of unions shifted towards, well, we're going to maintain control within the union, and one way to do that is not to have members involved nearly to the extent that they had been in the CIO unions in the 1930s and early 40s. Membership involvement was discouraged throughout that period. And this allowed in many unions outright corruption to set in, where elements of organized crime just took over unions in a whole. And this was fine, absolutely fine with corporations, because they were then able to sign sweetheart deals with some of these unions. where it was guaranteed that there wouldn't be significant improvements for the workers there. And on this also the government looked the other way. There would be an occasional show trial of somebody or other accused of particularly blatant corruption, but by and large it was allowed to flourish despite the fact that there were strong laws on the books against it. In this process, this rotting out of the labor movement occurred throughout the 1960s and 1970s in this country until along came Ronald Reagan in 1980. Became elected president. Many people still think, well, he was the one who brought down the union movement. He brought it down when, after the air traffic controllers went on strike in 1981, he fired all of them, thousands of them, just fired them wholesale and said, we don't care how long it takes to get the air traffic system back going, we're going to hire new people and train them, and these folks are never going to work here again. And that had a tremendous impact. But I would certainly argue he didn't bring down the labor movement by himself. It was an empty house of cards waiting to be blown over, and he was the one who was on hand to do it. And private corporations certainly took his cue throughout the 1980s, and they demanded concessions from unions, saying we're no longer going to pay you so much or have good benefits, and many unions gave in. Some were in very difficult circumstances where it would have been hard to resist no matter what. But in general, most had just forgotten how to fight. They had just forgotten how to fight because they hadn't done it in so long. And there were real threats to workers, absolutely, in terms of plant closing threats. I mean, it had been now for several decades the official government policy with tax breaks and everything else to encourage companies to move manufacturing plants out of this country into other countries. And so when the boss came to you and said, cut your wages by a third or we're going to move to the Dominican Republic, you had to believe that they may well be planning to do that. But what also was a problem for unions at this point is that they did not have public support anymore. They had become seen as taking care of their own members and not taking care of anyone else, not standing up for anyone else. And most people in America no longer saw it as something that mattered to them. And there were absolutely a huge number of unorganized workers that the labor movement hadn't gone out and organized who were employed in all kinds of different jobs and directly undermining the wages and benefits of those who were in union jobs because you were a cost disadvantage for your company. You know, other companies would eat their lunch. And your company would find places to move where they could set up with low-paid non-union workers. And labor rapidly plummeted from 35% of the workforce down to today barely 13% of the American workforce is in unions. Lost almost two-thirds. In the private sector, it's now under 10%. It's extremely difficult to influence wages and working conditions and benefits for your members when you have such a small percentage of the workers organized. There are very few industries, probably 2 or 3 at the most, where unions represent enough workers to actually serve as a real upward push on an industry. I'll give you an example would be say meat packing, where there's a large number of non-union shops, and if any of the unionized shops try too hard to push their wages up too high above where the non-union plants are at, they're going to find very quickly that their plant is simply going to be shut down and the work is going to be shifted over to non-union location. Without having most of that industry organized, it's going to be very difficult for anyone to move up their own wages and benefits. So having given up the right to influence social policy in the late 1940s, by the 1980s, unions had lost much of their ability to do what they thought they could do in exchange, which is to set the wages and the working conditions on the job. Now it was all gone. And so today you have a situation where corporations clearly have the upper hand at work and in society. It's very, very difficult to organize unorganized workers. Most workers want unions, but can't get them. If you try to organize, you're going to face an onslaught that you can't believe. Some of the people trying to organize a union in any given workplace are likely to be fired. Everybody will face a constant harassment on a daily basis, one-on-one meetings where they bring you in and grill you, and captive audience meetings where they force you to sit through lengthy diatribes. You're going to be told that your plant will close, or whatever workplace you're in will close if you have a union, and it will move somewhere else. And they scare the hell out of people, and it's generally very effective. Real wages, because of this, the wages that you get after you adjust for inflation, hardly grew throughout the economic expansion in the 1990s. They are still below the level of 1973. If you're doing the same job now as a job that was being done in 1973, you're going to get paid less for it as a working person in real dollars. You will have less buying power than our parents' generation did. And during this time, inequality just grew tremendously in this country. The gap in pay between the corporate CEOs and the workers who make the profits for them has just absolutely mushroomed, And there's been such a tremendous concentration of wealth in the hands of a few as has never been seen in any society on this planet, probably. And the social safety net has been tattered. We're going to see very bad times for millions of our fellow Americans if this recession we're entering into is at all deep or long. People here won't have much of a memory of the last recession, but if we're going to see tremendous problems for people who lose their jobs in the coming period. And this is in a situation where our poverty rate now, the percentage of people officially listed as in poverty, is still higher than the levels that we'd achieved in the early 70s. Through U.S. history, especially in this past century, in the 1900s, we had every decade, generally, you could expect that on average we were reducing the poverty levels, and that each generation ought to be doing better. We're no longer doing that. We're no longer progressing as a society. We're no longer doing that. So what can be done? How can labor reverse these trends? Well, I would say we have to, in the labor movement, reassert ourselves as a movement for economic and social justice for all working people. We have to speak out and lead on issues not just at the workplaces that we already represent, but on issues throughout society and throughout the world. This is how we move things forward in the 1930s. Obviously, the issues are different, the times are different, but it's still the basic formula that makes sense. The labor movement has to be much more than something seen as just taking care of its own individual members if it wants to have broad public support. And only then will it have the support it needs for new organizing, to create a situation again where no one will consider scabbing on a strike. Only then will it be socially unacceptable for a company to hire a consultant to figure out how to fire union supporters, which is protected by law in this country, that you're supposed to be able to have the right to be a union supporter and not be discriminated against on the job. But companies are expected at this point, when unions show up, to go out and hire consultants to figure out ways to fire people and get away with it. It should be just as socially unacceptable to do that as it would be socially unacceptable for a company to hire a lawyer or a consultant to figure out how to fire all the blacks in their workforce or all the females in their workforce and all the other types of discrimination that we've put an end to in this country. We need to make it just as much an issue of basic human rights in this country. Only then can everyone's standards be raised. Only then will it no longer be profitable for companies to operate to bust unions, because they know no matter where they go, they'll have to operate union anyway. Many in the labor movement now recognize this. It's something that's dawned on a lot of folks in the last decade. After getting heads beat in long enough, people have started to draw these conclusions and recognize what labor needs to do again. And there's been some very good positive steps in recent years. The AFL-CIO, the main labor federation, which my union is not a part of, we haven't rejoined since our departure back in the 1940s, but we work closely with many good AFL-CIO unions. They have a reform leadership that came in the mid-90s. John Sweeney was elected president there, and the first ever contested election in the history of that federation, as a matter of fact. And he and those working with him have tried to jumpstart a lot of these things, building coalitions, putting an emphasis on new organizing, taking an approach to political action that involves labor speaking out directly on the important issues to working people. But there are still a lot of what we call the old guard left in the labor movement, a lot of old habits there that need to be ended. And there's plenty of waste and not enough democracy. Those are real problems that the labor movement is still having to deal with, and we're working at piece by piece. But some things have worked, and all of these things that are working are things that are in fact transforming the unions as they happen, and I'll go through just a few of them. Something I work with very closely is something called Jobs with Justice, which is a coalition of labor and community and religious groups. It's a national organization, but it's really made up of a bunch of local chapters in various cities. It grew out of the Eastern Airlines strike in the late 1980s when a union buster took over Eastern Airlines and ended up destroying the airline in the end. But it's now the most effective way to bring labor and community organizations together to work on issues of common concern. Very basic union activities such as strike solidarity, strike support, organizing support, but also importantly community fights, perhaps on decent social services in a community where unions are helping, or fighting discrimination, or working for better housing. National fights, like, again, for national health insurance has been one thing that Jobs with Justice has worked on a lot, on the right to organize and other matters like that. Local coalitions set their own agendas. A lot of them work on things such as working to get living wage ordinances passed, an extension of the minimum wage fight. And was happy to see right outside here a petition being circulated for a living wage ordinance in this area. And if you haven't signed that petition, I hope you consider doing that. But also fighting on other things in local communities, depending on what it is, ending abuse of day labor workers, many different issues that come up, and also working on international issues like sweatshop labor and fair trade policies for this country. This model of the labor movement as a movement for social justice has also worked on in the area of new organizing. You look at something like the Justice for Janitors campaign that the Service Employees Union has put together in many places across this country. It's brought in thousands and thousands of new members to that union and allowed these folks to have much improved wages and benefits, many of them getting health insurance, for example, for the first time ever for these janitors. And they've been able, in the course of this, to develop a very broad public support, both because the high level of exploitation has been exposed. I mean, you have people working in incredibly fancy offices, like in Century City and in Los Angeles, yet these people are being paid basically pennies. So that's been exposed, but also the union has reached out and cultivated community support, and this has been very important. In basic strike actions, this has also worked. The Teamsters Union briefly had a reform leadership in the mid-90s, and they took on United Parcel Service, UPS, a huge company. And the issue they took them on about and went on strike about was to convert thousands and thousands of part-time jobs that had been created in that company, convert them into full-time, family-supporting jobs with benefits, the American dream again. And they took this issue out to the American people and said, this is what our fight is about. And they got the support of the American people. And UPS could not afford to operate in a situation where they knew the American people weren't going to support them, and they had to settle the strike, and the Teamsters won a large measure of what they were looking for on this issue. This helped the workers at UPS. It also helps society as a whole to move us back towards a saner situation where people can go to work for 40 hours and be done and know that they can take care of their family rather than having to work multiple part-time jobs. Some of these things are also done in the area of international solidarity, where we start looking for the labor movement to speak out on behalf of working people in other countries rather than scapegoating them or rather than being racist towards them, which is what was a tendency in some unions in the past. These workers are not stealing our jobs in other countries. they're in a desperate situation where they're generally being forced out of what their traditional industries have been, or off the farms or whatever else, as their governments work to bring U.S. corporations in there to exploit them at very low wages. And so what we're doing now instead is we're helping each other organize. Our union has a relationship with a progressive union in Mexico called the FAT, and we have a brochure out front about it that you can pick up if you'd like. And we have delegations that go back and forth, so workers here can learn about workers there and vice versa. But we help them in organizing plants that have gone down there that have run away from there. They've sent organizers up to help us when we've been organizing in plants that have large Mexican populations in this country, and we can use somebody else who speaks Spanish and understands the situation of the workers. And many other unions are doing this kind of work. This is just a taste of what can be achieved if the movement, that is the greater societal movement, is put back in the labor movement. This is what the labor movement needs to do in order to be relevant and in order to survive. But this is also what American society needs in order to be healthy and prosperous. Otherwise, we face a future of growing polarization between the haves and the have-nots, with more and more Americans in the have-not category. Just last week, new government data reported that in the year 2000, still in an 8-year-long economic expansion, the median income of Americans actually went down, not up. The median being the level at which half the people are earning less and half the people are earning more. The mean, the average, is probably going up because the people at the very top are making so much money, it unbalances it. But if you want to look at where are most American people at, the average actually went down in real income last year, as more and more wealth is getting concentrated in the hands of the wealthiest sliver of society. Graduates of universities like this, instead of pursuing the American dream, are going to find your salaries undermined by cheap labor, both cheap labor here in the U.S. and cheap labor abroad. So let me end by calling on those of you who are students to study these issues, and not just in class, and to join labor support groups if you can. And I call on those of you here from the community to join in coalitions with labor unions. And I call on those of you who are in workplaces, or will be in workplaces soon, to form unions there. And yes, push those unions to be democratic, push those unions to be bold, and most of all, to be outspoken leaders of society, to put the movement back in the labor movement. Thank you.
All right, those who need to sort of filter out, do so, and we'll take questions in just a minute or two.
But either Mike, and I guess I'm supposed to go back and forth, so we'll see how it works. Go ahead.
I was wondering if the current trend within the last couple of weeks that looks like it's going to continue to curtail the civil liberties of Americans in the name of what our government likes to call national security disturbs you, and if so, what can we do about it?
Good question. Thank you. That's an issue near and dear to our union's heart, especially as a union that was greatly victimized by another time in American history during the Cold War, when civil liberties were greatly curtailed and people's constitutional rights were abused left and right. And there were some nice Supreme Court rulings about 20 years later that just about everything our government did was wrong and shouldn't have happened, but it didn't save the lives and careers of those that it had destroyed. This is absolutely crucial to all of us, anybody who's a citizen, but particularly anybody who is working for any kind of constructive change within this country, that we have to be able to speak out and to say what we think about government policies or anything else that we want to. Without anybody having the ability to question what the government does, we lead towards a cycle of increased unaccountability, and the old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. excuse me, is very, very true, and I've seen that play out in lots of cases. Even those with the best intentions have to have some check on them, and that's really what civil liberties is about. And we've lost already in the workplace, unions have lost the protection of the Bill of Rights. If we start losing it outside the workplace also, it's going to be even harder to organize. So what you can do about it, certainly write letters to the newspaper, write letters to your congressman, join with peace and justice coalitions. I know you have one here in Manhattan, in fact, because many of those, I know certainly the ones in Chicago are speaking out that one of the things we must not do in these circumstances is to do to ourselves what the terrorists couldn't do, which is to destroy part of the fabric of American society, the most important part, which is our freedom to say what we think and see what the truth can bring out and who can be convinced, so we can do the right things as a society. I guess this side next. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, since American industry has globalized over this past decade or two, wouldn't it not be easier for American unionism to globalize at the same rate, rather than just to work, in situ with say Mexican unions and third world country unions?
Well, absolutely. I mean, what it means to globalize the unions exactly is a difficult question, but certainly for unions across the world to work together. And in fact, here's a dirty little secret. Our union and other American unions are trying to help support unions in Mexico and throughout Latin America as they struggle to get on their feet against very repressive governments and very repressive corporations. And there are chunks of unions there that have existed for a while that aren't really unions. They're protection rackets for the companies, and they operate with violence against anybody who tries to challenge for better pay and benefits. And there's a lot of dead union organizers all through Latin America. But as much as we kind of see the need to help out the Mexican workers and the others in forming better unions, European unions now see the U.S. in that way, because more and more European companies are moving plants from Europe into the United States, because our living standards, our wages have slipped so much that it's become cheaper for them to produce over here than in Europe. And so my union, we're not too proud to ask for, has received the support of unions in companies where we have a plant here, they have a plant in Europe. We've received their support in strike situations, in organizing battles, etc. It's exactly what we need to do, is to have these relationships across the borders, because the companies are operating across borders like that. But while we need to do that, we also need to have fair trade instead of this quote-unquote free trade, which it's really not anything about trade. It's about our corporations going to be allowed to go and take everything to the lowest common denominator in terms of standards. And there's just too many countries where companies can go where the government is corrupt. They pay somebody off and they do whatever they want there and then import the stuff back here. And as long as we're allowing that as a society, we're going to be undermining our own wages and living standards. It's what we've been doing, and until we change that, it's what's going to continue to happen. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier about the living wage petition. Could you please define what is meant by a living wage?
Sure. Really, the living wage is an extension of a minimum wage, saying this is a level below which nobody should be expected to work. The difference is, the minimum wage is generally set at the federal level, and then states sometimes have their own minimum wage that in some cases are higher, and it depends on the nature of your business, which one is the one that governs for you. But the living wage campaign grew out of the idea that we ought to be able to enact things at a local level. Part of the problem in this country, because it's so big, is it's very hard for movements to impact federal legislation, and sometimes it's a lot easier to organize at the local level. So what a Living Wage Coalition does is it basically goes to a local government, a city, a county, and says, look, we're spending a lot of the people's tax dollars here. And in the course of doing that, we ought to be setting some kind of standard that's higher than the very minimum standard. We ought to at least be saying that we're going to pay people enough to survive on. We're going to pay people enough that they can be fully functioning members of this community, that they're not going to be being paid so low that they're going to become drains on this community because they aren't going to be able to pay a decent rent, and therefore they're more likely to become homeless. They're going to be in a situation where they're going to have to rely on food stamps. They're not going to have their kids prepared for school, be able to get decent child care. And in fact, that's what these low-wage jobs do, is they breed a tremendous number of social problems, which the public ends up paying for in one way or another anyway, either through having to spend a lot more money on remedial education, or eventually by paying for prisons for people. All of these are a very expensive way to deal with poverty. And why don't we fix it up front by at least making sure that the public money is paid to people at a level where they can at least keep themselves out of poverty. And so typically what a Living Wage Coalition does is it figures out what's the wage that you would need to work a regular 40-hour week and support a family of 4 on that and be above the poverty level. And typically it runs in the $8-9 an hour level, which is still not tremendous money. I'm sure for a lot of you who are students and knowing, I remember working jobs when I was a student. I know they ain't great paid, so this may sound all right, but in terms of actually supporting a family on it, it's still very rough. But they're saying at least with the public money, we ought to spend that money, any contracts the city gives out, any companies that we're giving tax breaks to and thereby encouraging them to expand here and operate here, et cetera, that money ought to come with it a guarantee that people are going to get paid at least at this $8 or $9 level and have some decent benefits that go with it. And it's a fairly simple idea, but it's caught on in a lot of places, and it's been something that unions and community groups and religious groups have organized around very effectively and passed these types of ordinances in many places across the country. And it's an important step on building support for raising the minimum wage in the country as a whole, but in the meantime, at least saying that our public money, the taxes we pay, shouldn't be used to promote poverty. Because when you privatize these jobs from city governments and allow these firms to then pay people minimum wage, we are, with our tax dollars, promoting poverty, and it's a very bad thing for us to be doing as a society. So that's what the living wage is about.
Thanks very much for coming to talk to us. I grew up in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. I don't know if you know anything about Windsor.
Mm-hmm. Quite a bit, right across from Detroit.
We are the proud home of the only unionized Walmart.
That's right.
In the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you firsthand that those people are under a tremendous amount of pressure. They are shown films weekly about why unions will rob them and hurt them and cause their lives to be miserable, and how unions are corrupt. And these are just company films that they are forced to go to meetings to watch. Both my grandfathers were in the UAW mm-hmm. and participated in the strikes, in very, very smart strikes. They were not allowed to create picket lines. They were forbidden to do this during the war. So what they did is they all took their cars and parked them as close to the building right next to one another as they possibly could. And they did that for about a 5-mile radius around the Ford plant. Mm-hmm. And you know what? Strangely, no one could get to work. It worked beautifully. I was a member of the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union at the age of 13, and my dad was a union steward for the maintenance workers union at a plant when I was growing up. So, and as an American historian, I want to say that what you told the audience tonight was correct. It was not incorrect in any way. My final question is then, so obviously unions are a big part of my past, and they're dear to my heart. And tonight, last night, the Minnesota workers went on strike, 22,000 people. And what I'm concerned about, what I want you to address, is how do we deal with the media? Because the media has turned strikes and workers' issues into a consumer issue. It is no longer, what are those workers wanting there? What is the situation that workers are facing that would cause them to go on strike? Rather, it is the people of Minnesota are now having a problem because their workers are on strike. And what are you going to do about your trash collection? And how is your life as a consumer going to be impacted? And the underlying message over and over again is these are selfish people who are only thinking of themselves and therefore to be despised as union members. And I wanted you to address that somehow.
Okay. I will address that, but first I want to address the first thing you said about Walmart, just so people know what workers are up against. In this country, here's one of the ways Walmart has stayed non-union. It's very difficult to organize the general department store workers in Walmart. Very few department store workers are organized in general because of the nature of the work and part-time and turnover and a lot of other things. But historically, butchers have been fairly well organized in this country, and Walmart started opening meat departments in stores all over this country, and the union that organizes butchers went in and started organizing the butchers, and were successful at winning an election to represent the workers in one Walmart. And it was not a large number of workers. I don't remember, a dozen, 20, something like that. Walmart, within a month or so, announced that it was going to end all processing of meat at its stores. The only meat would be pre-butchered that was brought from elsewhere. They fired every butcher they had in every Walmart store across the country. And I think they had at least 200 or 300 stores with butchers in them at that point. So they fired hundreds, possibly thousands of workers because one small group had the temerity to organize, and they wanted to make sure that that cancer wouldn't spread. So that's what workers are up against when you mention Walmart. And hats off to the workers in Windsor, Ontario for holding tough against that. That's in part because the labor laws are better in Canada, and there's a higher union rate in Canada, and a bunch of other things. But for your question of the media, look, most of the main media in this country is now owned by big corporations. GE, who I've been sitting here taking pot shots at and is the biggest corporation my union deals with, they own NBC. They just own it, okay? They aren't going to run a story that's particularly friendly to a union like mine. That's for damn sure. And you can find corporate ownership of almost every major city newspaper and TV station at this point. Very few of them are in independent media family hands anymore who are interested in the public good. And that's just a fact that we have to deal with. Having said that, there are things that unions can do anyway. What the Teamsters did, for example, by framing their strike and working in the public up ahead of time about this is to create family supporting jobs. They did a very effective job and had that in the media already before they went on strike. But they had been doing coalition work in a lot of places. And that's really what unions have to do to make up for the fact that the media is going to be against us. We've got to be working directly with the community. The people throughout these cities, the people throughout the state of Minnesota have to know already why the public workers feel that they need to do what they're going to do. They can't just wake up and see it one day in the newspaper. There has to have already been involvement. There has to have been a struggle going on these issues. Teachers' unions can't operate in a vacuum where all of a sudden, every parent in town is thinking, now I got to find some expensive babysitting for my kids because there's no school. There has to have been involvement with the PTAs and with all the other organizations that parents might be involved in to have them be on the teacher's side up ahead in those struggles. That's why being part, and to do that, you've got to be supporting the parents in what they're looking for. You've got to be supporting the state employees in Minnesota. You have to be supporting the citizens of Minnesota and the things that they're looking for. You've got to be, this is all part of this question of creating a movement. We are probably going to have to eventually generate our own independent media. And in fact, back in the heyday of labor had its own radio stations, and a lot of unions had daily newspapers, certainly at least weekly newspapers that were read by large sections of the community because so many people in the community were in unions. So we may need to find ways to get our own message out in those ways. But it's not, by the time you go on strike, it's too late to be looking to get public support for your strike. You have to have been building it by being involved in the community up ahead of time.
Hi. Another HERE former member. I was an organizer in grad school, and I had two questions. One is that it seems as though a lot of the current most active organizing drives are in groups of people that have not traditionally been the backbone of the union movement. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's going to mean for the labor movement to have university professors, graduate students, hospital, medical technicians, a different sort of labor force really entering the union movement. And secondly, it seems to me that a lot of people are now working in very different working places, and there's a lot of, I mean, the traditional organizing structure was to work around the workplace organizer, right? You go in and you talk to people at work. And it seems that a lot of people are starting to move more towards much more fluid, internet-based or mobile kinds of work that has posed a difficulty for organizing if you don't have people physically in one space. How do you go about organizing people across those kinds of distances? Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Neither of those are easy questions. To the first question, and my union is right there with those organizing out of traditional spheres. We've organized a large group of graduate employees at the University of Iowa. We've organized a hospital in California, even though our original base is the electrical industry. The electrical industry, by and large, has been destroyed in this country. If we were limited to organizing the electrical industry only, we would evaporate. And most unions face the same situation. And that's fine. I mean, we have to organize all workers wherever they're at. You know, part of it is a question of, is that workforce really that different? Now, certainly what is different is there are a lot more women being organized into unions than was once true, and that's great. That's great, and I don't think it's something that we have had a tremendous problem adjusting to. Other than that, a lot of unions still haven't fully recognized that within their leaderships, and that's something that they're going to need to do to be more reflective of their newer memberships. But I think the question kind of more is, well, these are folks who definitely aren't the old style factory workers, and I think actually the issues are frequently very similar. You just have to spend a little bit of time thinking about them, but you still have the same basic clashes over relating to, you know, the interest of the employer is not necessarily the same as the interest of the worker. That's what underlies it, that the employer would rather see people working for less and working harder and having less say-so on the job and being able to be treated in any kind of discriminatory manner that the boss wants. That makes it easier for him to do his job. And the workers are looking for fairness and decency and you know, it's going to cost the employer something. As soon as you start getting at those issues, things aren't really that different. The tactics that you need to use are probably somewhat different. I mean, in a lot of those cases, a strike is not the same. You know, a strike that shuts down a production line, it's pretty clear what's happening there, and the boss has invested all this money in capital, and all of a sudden he can't make a profit off of it, and he's sitting there with customers screaming at him that they want their product, and et cetera. So in many workplaces it isn't exactly the same, but you find what is the alternative that can work. You know, what are the things you do that similarly, you know, what you essentially want to do is figure out what is it that the employer really wants you to do and how you can stop doing it to get their attention. And for graduate employees, it might be to stop grading papers, for example, has been a tactic that has been used so that grades can't be given out. So based on that, that's where they get some leverage from. So it's working those issues through. And the labor movement, by and large, is not doing a real bad job of adjusting to that. What the labor movement is having problems with in some places is people who are newly organized are organized because they want to take control of their lives. They haven't had any control, and now for the first time they're having some control. And part of that having control is they want to have some control in their unions too. And unions that haven't been organizing for a long time aren't used to sharing control. They're used to there being a business agent who's going to make the decisions, and there might be membership votes, but it's pro forma. Everything's been decided ahead of time, and you just move and you just roll on. And they've been able to accomplish some things that way, but frankly, the new members aren't going to put up with it. So with this new organizing on campuses and other places, we've seen some real tensions develop. Not my union, because we have a very strong democratic tradition, but certainly a lot of other unions have seen problems develop of clashes between the newly organized folks and the unions. But that's healthy, because it's going to change those unions for the better as those things get worked out over time. So that was your first question, and now I've lost track of your second question. If you could just...
How do you organize when there's no workplace?
Oh, right. First of all, I tend to think that it's somewhat overstated in terms of people not having a workplace, because, in fact, management has found that they lose too much control if they don't have people reporting in at least part of the time, number one. Number two, unions have found ways to do this before. Truck drivers used to be very heavily organized. A lot of that's been lost, but, truck drivers are all over the place. And yet the Teamsters found ways to organize them. It's harder, but it can be done. I know the West Coast Longshoremen, the other union I talked about, they're busy organizing messenger services out in California and on the West Coast. And, these are folks who hardly ever see each other. But you can do it. We've, in the course of some of our public sector organizing in Iowa, we've organized a whole bunch of school bus drivers. I mean, these are folks who are together for maybe 5 minutes a day, as they pick up or drop off their buses. So you spend a lot of time talking to people at home. And in fact, most union organizing is done that way anyway. It's very difficult to talk to people on the job. The boss is just on top of folks and isn't going to allow you to have any kind of decent conversation. Union organizer isn't allowed on the property anyway, but you'd like to be able to rely on those who are in favor of having a union to talk to their fellow workers. And companies have made that an extremely difficult thing to do, another limitation on free speech in this country. So I think the problems with that are probably exaggerated. It's more a technical problem for unions than it is some major qualitative difference from the past, at least from our experience.
I also have two questions, but maybe the first one just is a yes or no. Isn't one of labor's problems too many workers chasing too few dollars? And if so, are U.S. labor unions in favor of slowing population growth? The second question is, what's the best way to counter the prevalent attitude that I see that I'm not my brother's keeper, that I'm in this dog-eat-dog life to get what I can get while the getting's good?
Right. Okay. On the first question, no is my answer, but because we still have tremendous resources as a country. It's just that most of them are in the hands of a relatively small number of people, and if we spread them out more equally, everybody could do a lot better. And having more people means you have more people being able to produce, and therefore you can create enough wealth for folks. But the other thing, this is what we really need to get back to, is we ought to be working less hours. We ought to be down to 35 hours or 30 hours or whatever else. And then you could have a true flowering of human society in this country, and then we could take care of our families and not have so many kids wandering the streets unsupervised. And that's what we ought to do if we have more people who want to work than we have work for. The question of this being a dog-eat-dog world as opposed to being your brother's keeper, this is the central question. What kind of society do we want to be? In the 1930s, people were absolutely convinced that they ought to stand up for each other. Since that period, certainly in the 1980s, the famous Wall Street movie, greed is good. This idea that greed but the way they justified that, though, is that they said that if you allowed greed to run unfettered, it would create great things for society. Well, I think what's happening is people are finding out that's not true. And I think the pendulum the pendulum has slowed. I'm not sure it started swinging the other way yet, but it's at least slowed in its swing towards the greed is good point of view. And I'm hoping over the coming period that we can see it going back the other way. And I'll say for one, I mean, coming out of the tragedy on September 11th, I mean, certainly, you know, the right wing in this country is trying to use what happened there to do a lot of different things. It was mentioned to curtail civil liberties. Some Republican congressmen announced that to solve our problems of the economy that are now suddenly due to what happened here, we need to pass fast-track legislation to make it possible to get more free trade deals through right away. In the name of patriotism, this is something that they've been trying to pass for years, and it was extremely unpopular with the American people, and they couldn't get through Congress. And so they're trying to move their kind of agenda through that. I would hope to see an opposite response in this country. You know, there's been a tremendous pulling together and a tremendous amount of people thinking, you know, the value of life and the value of society. And I would hope if there's any good that can come out of such a terrible thing as that, it would be that people would start to think again about creating justice in our society, not just taking care of ourselves, but taking care of everybody in a fair way.
Those of you who would like to ask Mr. Rosen some more questions, you are invited for further discussion at a reception in his honor at the house of Christopher Renner, 508 Valley Drive. If you need directions on how to get there, come up here and somebody who knows will tell you. I should also point out that this talk was co-sponsored by the Manhattan Alliance for Peace and Justice, whose name came up once or twice anyway, and I'd just like to thank once again Mr. Carl Rosen.
Thank all of you for being a good audience and asking good questions and all of that. And don't forget, there is a petition outside. I'll give it one more plug and get to work on these issues. Thanks.